The rain was coming down in freezing sheets the night the locks were changed. I was 17, my sister Chloe was barely 15, and we were standing on the porch staring at a black trash bag holding everything we owned. Our stepfather, Richard, didn't even have the decency to look us in the eye through the glass when he mouthed the words, "Get off my property." We had absolutely nowhere to go, exactly $14 between us, and no family left, or so we thought. Blind desperation drove us into the woods that night, toward the abandoned plot of land our late grandpa Arthur had left behind. But what we found buried beneath the mud out there didn't just put a roof over our heads. It uncovered a jaw-dropping family secret that saved our lives and ultimately destroyed the man who threw us away. Grief does strange things to people, but I quickly learned that greed does even worse. My mother, Sarah, had passed away just 3 weeks prior after a brutal, year-long battle with cancer. She was our rock, the only parent Chloe and I had ever really known. Our biological father had vanished before Chloe could even walk, and for a long time, it was just the three of us against the world. Then came Richard. Richard was a regional manager for a mid-sized logistics company, a man who wore ironed slacks on weekends and spoke in a monotone voice that always made me feel like I was in a corporate performance review. Mom married him when I was 14. She thought he was stable, safe, and a good provider. But the moment the doctors gave Mom her terminal diagnosis, Richard started pulling away. He stopped coming to the hospital. He started asking her to sign routine paperwork when she was heavily medicated. At the time, I was just a terrified teenager trying to hold my little sister together. I didn't know anything about estate law or deeds. 3 weeks after we buried her, the fragile truce in our house shattered. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. The air in Washington state was already turning bitter and damp. I had just walked home from my part-time shift at the grocery store, shivering in my thin jacket, when I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open to find Richard standing in the foyer, arms crossed, flanked by 2 large, industrial-sized trash bags. The house felt unnaturally quiet. Chloe was sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, her knees pulled to her chest, trembling. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. I looked from Chloe to Richard. "You're leaving," Richard said. It wasn't a threat or a shout. It was stated as a simple, unchangeable fact. "I've sold the house. The new owners take possession at the end of the month, and I am moving to Portland on Friday." I blinked, the exhaustion from my shift suddenly replaced by a sharp, icy spike of adrenaline. "What do you mean, sold the house? This is Mom's house. It's our home," Richard sighed, the kind of heavy, put-upon sigh an adult uses when dealing with a slow child. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Your mother transferred the deed to my name 6 months ago to consolidate our finances. Legally, the property is mine. As for the 2 of you, I have no legal obligation to house you. You're 17, Liam. Emancipate yourself. Find a shelter. I don't care, but you aren't staying here." "You can't do this," I yelled, stepping toward him. "Chloe is a minor. You're her stepfather." "Actually, I never legally adopted either of you," Richard replied smoothly, stepping back and gesturing toward the open door, "which means I am legally nothing to you but a former roommate. I packed your clothes. Leave the keys on the counter. If you aren't off the property in 5 minutes, I am calling the police and having you trespassed." The sheer audacity of it, the cold, calculated cruelty, paralyzed me. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to tear the house apart. But then I looked at Chloe. Tears were streaming silently down her pale cheeks. If I fought Richard, I'd end up in a holding cell, and Chloe would be handed over to the foster system. He had planned this perfectly. He waited until Mom was gone, took everything of value, and discarded us like old furniture. "Fine," I spat, my voice shaking with a rage I had never felt before. I walked over, picked up the heavier trash bag, and handed the lighter one to Chloe. I didn't look back as we walked out into the freezing autumn rain. I heard the deadbolt slide into place, with a heavy, final thud right behind us. We walked for 2 miles in the pouring rain until we reached a 2-4-hour diner on the edge of town. We sat in a back booth, soaking wet, our trash bags tucked under the table. The waitress, an older woman named Brenda, who knew Mom, brought us hot chocolates and didn't ask why we looked like drowned rats. I emptied my pockets onto the sticky Formica table. $14.63. Liam? Chloe whispered, her hands wrapped tightly around the warm mug. Where are we going to sleep tonight? What are we going to do? I stared at the meager pile of coins. We had no close family. Mom was an only child, and her parents were gone. The only relative we had left was Grandpa Arthur, Mom's dad, but Grandpa Artie had died 5 years ago. Grandpa Artie was a legendary figure in our family, mostly because he was considered entirely eccentric, if not outright paranoid. He was a retired structural engineer who spent the last 20 years of his life preparing for the end of the world. He bought a 10-acre plot of dense, overgrown forest, about 20 miles outside of town, off a forgotten dirt logging road. He lived there in a rickety wooden cabin, stockpiling canned beans, reading survivalist manuals, and ranting about economic collapse. When he died of a sudden heart attack, he left the land to Mom. It was completely worthless. The county wouldn't zone it for commercial use. The land was mostly rock and dense root systems, and the cabin was essentially a wooden shack. Mom had tried to sell it for years, but eventually just kept paying the minimal property taxes on it, keeping it as a sort of useless family heirloom. Because the deed to that land was considered basically worthless, Richard hadn't bothered to have Mom sign it over. It was still in Mom's name, which meant, by default, it belonged to her next of kin, us. I have an idea, I said, trying to force a confidence into my voice that I absolutely did not feel. We're going to Grandpa Artie's place. Chloe looked horrified. The cabin in the woods? Liam, it's been abandoned for 5 years. Mom said the roof was caving in. It's 20 miles away, I said, my mind racing. We can take the early morning bus to the county line and hike the rest of the way. It's shelter, Chloe. It's ours. Richard can't touch us there. We just need a place to stay out of the rain until I can figure things out. She didn't argue. She was too tired, too broken. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the booth, trying to sleep in shifts, while the neon sign of the diner buzzed overhead. The journey to Grandpa Artie's land was a nightmare. The next morning, we spent 4 of our precious $14 on 2 bus tickets that took us to the absolute edge of the county transit line. From there, we had an 8-mile hike up an old, unpaved logging road. The rain from the night before had turned the road into a thick, soup-like mud that sucked at our sneakers with every step. I carried both our trash bags slung over my shoulders to free up Chloe's hands, but the plastic was digging into my skin, and the physical exhaustion of grief and homelessness was settling deep into my bones. By the time we finally found the rusted iron gate marking Grandpa Artie's property, the sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, eerie shadows through the dense pines. The gate hung off its hinges, strangled by overgrown blackberry brambles. We pushed past it, walking up the winding driveway until the cabin came into view. Chloe let out a small, defeated sob, and honestly, I wanted to join her. Mom hadn't exaggerated. The cabin was a disaster. It was a single-story wooden structure that looked like it was slowly being swallowed by the forest. Half of the corrugated metal roof had caved in under the weight of fallen branches. The front porch was rotted through, the windows were shattered, and thick green moss carpeted the exterior walls. "We can't sleep in there, Liam," Chloe said, her voice trembling. "It's going to collapse." "We have to," I said firmly, dropping the bags. "Just for tonight. Let me check it out." I carefully navigated the rotting porch steps and stepped inside. The smell of mildew and wet wood was overpowering. Inside, it was completely gutted. Scavengers or kids had clearly broken in over the years, taking anything of value and smashing the rest. The only dry spot was a small corner in the back room where the roof was still somewhat intact. I dragged our bags into that corner. I found an old, moldy canvas tarp buried under some debris and used it to create a makeshift barrier against the wind blowing through the broken windows. It was pitiful. We were a 17-year-old and a 15-year-old sitting on the dusty floor of a ruined shack, miles from civilization, with no food, no heat, and $10 to our name. As darkness fully set in, the temperature plummeted. Chloe was shivering violently, wrapped in every piece of clothing she had in her bag. "I need to make a fire," I told her, standing up. "I'm going to look around back for some dry wood under the overhang." "Don't leave me alone too long," she whispered, her eyes wide in the gloom. "I'll be right outside," I promised. I stepped out the back door into the overgrown yard. The moonlight was barely cutting through the thick canopy of trees. I kicked around the tall, wet grass, looking for anything that wasn't completely soaked. I walked toward what looked like the remnants of an old tool shed. As I took a step toward it, my boot caught on something hard and unforgiving hidden in the tall grass. I pitched forward, landing hard in the freezing mud, scraping my palms on sharp rocks. "Damn it," I hissed, sitting up and wiping the mud from my face. I looked back to see what I had tripped over. It wasn't a root. It was perfectly straight. I crawled back over, brushing the wet, dead leaves and thick mud away with my hands. My fingers brushed against cold, rusted metal. My heart started to beat a little faster as I frantically dug at the earth, pushing away years of accumulated forest debris. It was a large, square, steel plate set flush into a thick, concrete frame poured into the ground. At one end was a heavy, recessed iron handle. Beside the handle was a massive, heavy-duty padlock, thick with orange rust, securing a thick latch. Grandpa Artie, the prepper, the paranoid engineer, he didn't just build a cabin, he built something underneath it. "Chloe," I yelled, scrambling to my feet. "Chloe, come here, bring my phone flashlight." A minute later, Chloe came running out the back door, shining the weak light of my dying cell phone into the yard. What is it? Are you okay?" "Look at this," I said, pointing down at the cleared square of metal. She stared at it, confused. "Is that a cellar?" "I think it's a bunker," I said, feeling a wild surge of hope. If Grandpa Artie had built a bunker, maybe it was dry, maybe there were blankets, maybe there was something, anything, that could help us survive the night. "It's locked," she pointed out, shivering as she aimed the light at the massive padlock. I looked around frantically. "Hold the light steady." I ran over to the collapsed tool shed. Rummaging through the rotting wood and rusted nails, my hand closed around something heavy. It was a solid steel crowbar, covered in dirt, but completely intact. I ran back to the hatch. I jammed the hooked end of the crowbar through the shackle of the rusted padlock. The lock was thick, but the rust had eaten away at the internal mechanism for 5 years. I braced my boots against the concrete frame, gripped the crowbar with both hands, and threw my entire body weight backward. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a sharp, metallic crack that echoed through the quiet woods, the hasp of the padlock snapped. I tossed the broken lock into the grass and grabbed the iron handle of the hatch. It was incredibly heavy, the hinges protesting with a loud, shrieking groan as I hauled it upward. It slammed back against the earth, revealing a dark, square hole. We leaned over the edge, Chloe shining the phone light down. The beam illuminated a steep set of industrial metal stairs descending into the pitch-black earth. A rush of air hit my face. It was stale and smelled of dust, but it wasn't damp. It was completely, blessedly dry. I looked at Chloe. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the pale light of the phone. "Stay behind me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hold on to the railing." Taking a deep breath, I put my foot on the first metal grate and began our descent into the dark, completely unaware that the world we were about to walk into would rewrite everything we thought we knew about our family. The metal stairs felt like ice through the thin soles of my wet sneakers. I counted 22 steps before my boots finally hit a solid, flat surface. Chloe was right behind me, her hands gripping the back of my jacket so tightly I could feel her knuckles digging into my spine. "Liam?" she whispered, her voice bouncing off the tight, enclosed walls. "It's so dark. I can't see anything." "Hold the phone up," I instructed, sweeping my hand along the cold wall to my right. My fingers brushed against smooth, painted cinder block. "There has to be a light switch or a breaker box down here. Grandpa Artie wouldn't build a bunker without power." The weak beam of the phone light illuminated a heavy, submarine-style steel door at the end of a short corridor. It had a massive turning wheel in the center. Unlike the rusted padlock above, this wheel was heavily greased and practically gleamed in the dim light. I grabbed the wheel with both hands, braced my feet, and pulled. It turned with surprising ease, and the heavy door swung outward on perfectly balanced hinges. We stepped over the threshold into a larger, cavernous black space. To my immediate left, my hand smacked against a metal panel. I pried the cover open, feeling a row of heavy industrial switches. I held my breath, flipped the main breaker, and prayed to whatever was listening. Deep within the walls, something groaned. Then, a low, steady hum vibrated through the floorboards. A second later, a row of recessed LED lights flickered once, twice, and then flooded the space with a warm, brilliant, white light. Chloe gasped, dropping my jacket. I just stood there, completely paralyzed by shock. This wasn't a dirt cellar. It wasn't a damp hole filled with expired cans of beans. It was a subterranean apartment, built with the meticulous, exacting precision of a master structural engineer. The floors were poured concrete, sealed with a pristine gray epoxy. To our right was a compact but fully functional kitchenette, complete with stainless steel counters, a propane-powered stovetop, and a deep sink. To the left was a living area featuring a worn but comfortable-looking leather sofa, a heavy oak coffee table, and a wall lined entirely with floor-to-ceiling metal shelving. Those shelves were a sight I will never forget. They were packed with perfectly organized, vacuum-sealed buckets of dehydrated food, gallons of purified water, medical kits, heavy wool blankets, and survival gear. At the far end of the room were two closed doors. "Oh my God," Chloe breathed, walking slowly toward the center of the room, as if it were a mirage that might vanish if she stepped too hard. "He really did it," I muttered, awe washing over me. Everyone called him crazy. Everyone said he was just wasting his pension out here in the mud. He built a fortress. I walked over to a digital thermostat mounted on the wall. It read 55 degrees chilly, but a paradise compared to the freezing rain above us. A ventilation system hummed quietly, pumping fresh, filtered air into the room from vents hidden near the ceiling. I opened the first door at the back of the room. It was a small bathroom with a composting toilet, a gravity-fed shower, and an entire rack of fresh towels and hygiene supplies. I opened the second door and felt a massive lump form in my throat. It was a bedroom. There were two twin-sized bunk beds, made up with thick flannel sheets and heavy quilts. In the corner sat a small wooden desk with a brass reading lamp. It was perfectly set up, waiting for people who needed it. It felt as though Grandpa Artie had known, even 5 years ago, that one day his grandchildren would come crawling out of the woods, desperately needing a place to sleep. Chloe walked into the bedroom, her eyes welling up with tears. The exhaustion finally caught up with her. She didn't even take her boots off. She just collapsed onto the bottom bunk, burying her face in the heavy wool blanket, and began to sob. It wasn't the panicked, terrified, crying from the front porch. It was the heavy, exhausted weeping of someone who finally felt safe. I went to the kitchenette, found a sealed packet of matches, and managed to ignite the small propane camping stove. I heated up a pot of bottled water, ripped open a Mylar pouch of freeze-dried beef stew I found on the shelf, and let it rehydrate. The smell of actual, hot food filled the bunker, cutting through the sterile scent of the filtered air. I brought a bowl to Chloe. She sat up, her face red and puffy, and ate it in absolute silence. "We're okay," I told her, my voice thick with emotion. I pulled a second blanket from the top bunk and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Richard can't find us here. We have food, we have a roof, we're going to be okay." She nodded slowly, setting the empty bowl on the floor. Within minutes, she was fast asleep. I stayed awake for hours. I walked the perimeter of the bunker, examining everything. I found the battery bank for the solar panels mounted somewhere on the roof above, the water filtration system, and the air scrubbers. Arthur hadn't just built this for a weekend getaway. He had built it to withstand a siege. But as I sat down at the small wooden desk in the bedroom, staring at the brass lamp, a nagging question began to itch at the back of my mind. Grandpa Artie was eccentric, yes, but he was also incredibly pragmatic. He wouldn't have poured tens of thousands of dollars into an underground bunker without a specific, calculated reason. I opened the top drawer of the desk. It was empty, save for a few pens and a heavy iron key. I opened the middle drawer. Nothing. I pulled open the bottom drawer. It was deeper than the others, and inside sat a small, fireproof Winchester lockbox with a 4-digit mechanical combination dial. I stared at it. The bunker had provided us with shelter, but shelter wasn't enough to get us our lives back. I needed to know what Arthur was hiding. I tried Mom's birth year, 1970. The dial wouldn't budge. I tried my birth year, 2008. Nothing. I tried Chloe's, 2010. Locked. I leaned back in the chair, rubbing my temples. What numbers mattered to a man who trusted no one? Then I remembered, when Arthur was still alive, he used to take me fishing at a little creek near his old house. He always wore a battered silver dog tag from his time in the Army Corps of Engineers. He used to tell me, "Your life starts the day you realize nobody is coming to save you, Liam." For me, that was April 16th, the day he shipped out 0416. My hands were shaking slightly as I rolled the metal dials. 0416. I grabbed the heavy latch and pulled. With a satisfying, heavy click, the lockbox popped open. The first thing I saw inside the lockbox made my heart stop beating for a full 3 seconds. It was cash, a lot of it. Tightly bound in thick rubber bands were stacks of $100 bills. I pulled them out, my hands trembling, and stacked them on the desk. 5 bundles in total. I had never seen that much money in my life. A quick count of the top bundle told me there was $10,000 in each. $50,000 in cold, hard, untraceable cash. It was enough to buy a used car, rent an apartment, hire a lawyer. It was enough to completely restart our lives. But the money wasn't the most important thing in the box. Beneath the cash lay a thick, heavy manila envelope wrapped in twine. It was stamped with the logo of a prominent Seattle law firm, Bradley, Hughes, and Sterling, estate law and corporate litigation. I untied the twine and dumped the contents onto the wooden desk. A dozen glossy photographs slid out, along with a thick stack of printed emails, bank statements, and a notarized legal document printed on heavy bond paper. I picked up the first photograph. It was a grainy telephoto shot of 2 men standing in an empty, dirt parking lot. One of the men was handing the other a thick manila envelope. I recognized the man receiving the envelope instantly. It was Richard, my stepfather. Except, the date stamp in the bottom corner of the photograph read August 14th, 2018. That was 4 years before Richard ever accidentally bumped into my mother at a coffee shop downtown. A cold, nauseating knot tightened in my stomach. I grabbed the printed emails. They were between Richard Caldwell and a man named William Sterling, a senior partner at the law firm. I began to read, and as my eyes scanned the harsh, black and white text, the entire, terrifying truth of our lives unspooled before me. Richard wasn't just a boring logistics manager. He was a corporate acquisition specialist for Apex Pacific Rail and Freight, a massive conglomerate trying to build a new distribution hub in the county. To build that hub, they needed a continuous 10-mile stretch of land near the highway. They had quietly bought up every plot of land in the valley, except for one 10-acre square sitting directly in the middle of their proposed route, Grandpa Artie's land. The emails detailed how Arthur had stubbornly refused to sell, no matter how much Apex offered. He knew what they were planning, and he hated corporate developers. Apex was desperate. If they couldn't get Arthur's land, a multi-million-dollar project would completely collapse. Then, Arthur died of a heart attack. The deed passed to my mother, Sarah. I found a memo typed by Richard to his superiors at Apex, dated shortly after Arthur's death. Target property is now in the possession of the deceased daughter, Sarah Pendleton. Subject is a single mother of 2, currently employed as a school teacher. Preliminary background checks indicate she is struggling financially. Direct purchase offers may arouse suspicion given the father's hostility. I recommend a close contact approach. I will integrate into the family structure to secure the asset quietly. I dropped the paper as if it were on fire. I felt sick. I actually leaned over the side of the desk, gagging as a wave of pure bile rose in my throat. He didn't love her. He never loved her. Richard targeted my mother. He researched her, stalked her, and manipulated his way into her life, into our home, for years, just to get his hands on a worthless-looking piece of dirt. He played the supportive husband, waiting for the right moment to convince her to transfer the assets. And when she got sick, when she was weak and dying and desperate for someone to take care of her children, he finally made his move. He had her sign everything over under the guise of consolidating finances for her care. Then, 3 weeks after she was buried, he threw her children out into the rain. "You monster," I whispered to the empty room, tears of absolute rage stinging my eyes. I forced myself to keep digging through the envelope. There had to be a reason Arthur had these photos. If Arthur knew Richard was a corporate shark before he died, why didn't he warn Mom? I found the answer at the very bottom of the pile. It was a private investigator's report. Arthur had hired a PI named Dennis O'Reilly to look into Apex Freight after they started harassing him. The report showed that O'Reilly had uncovered Richard's close contact strategy. Arthur had figured it out. He knew Richard was circling his daughter, but Arthur's heart gave out before he could expose him. However, Grandpa Artie was a paranoid, brilliant engineer who planned for every structural failure imaginable, including his own death. I picked up the heavy, notarized legal document from Bradley, Hughes, and Sterling. It was a declaration of trust, dated 2 weeks before Arthur passed away. I read the legal jargon carefully, my mind racing. Arthur hadn't just left the land to Mom. He had placed the 10-acre parcel, the bunker, and all of his remaining financial assets into an irrevocable, generation-skipping trust. My mother was merely the named trustee, meaning she could manage the property, but she never legally owned it. The sole, absolute beneficiaries of the trust were Arthur's grandchildren, Liam and Chloe Pendleton. I read the specific clause 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Any attempt by the trustee to sell, transfer, or deed the property to a non-blood relative or corporate entity shall be immediately null and void. Upon the death of the trustee, full, unencumbered ownership of the estate transfers immediately to Liam Pendleton and Chloe Pendleton. The deed Richard had forced my dying mother to sign, it was completely worthless. He legally owned nothing. The land, the bunker, and the $50,000 in the safe belonged exclusively to me and my sister. More than that, Richard had sold our childhood home, which had also been bundled into the estate trust by Mom years ago illegally. He was currently attempting to close a fraudulent real estate transaction, which was a massive federal crime. I looked over at Chloe, still sleeping peacefully on the bunk bed, wrapped in Grandpa Artie's heavy blankets. Yesterday, we were 2 homeless orphans with $14, terrified of a man who held all the power. Today, we had the money, we had the truth, and we had the legal weapon we needed to destroy him. I carefully folded the documents back into the envelope, leaving the cash in the safe. I locked the combination dial, stood up, and walked back out into the main living area of the bunker. I found a heavy, steel-toed pair of Arthur's old work boots on the shelf. They were a little big, but I laced them up tightly. I wasn't scared anymore. The freezing rain, the eviction, the sheer helplessness, it was gone, replaced by a cold, burning focus. Richard Caldwell thought he was playing a long game against a vulnerable family. He didn't realize he had stepped onto a minefield built by a man who spent his entire life preparing for war. Tomorrow morning, I was taking $50,000 in a folder full of corporate espionage documents straight into the polished, glass-walled offices of Bradley, Hughes, and Sterling in downtown Seattle. And Richard Caldwell was going to lose everything. The next morning, the storm had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp, biting cold that stripped the last of the dead leaves from the trees. Inside the bunker, the air was warm and still. I woke up at 6 a.m., my mind crystal clear. There was no room for grief right now, and no room for fear. There was only the mission. I woke Chloe up and explained the plan. I showed her the money and the documents. For the first time since Mom died, I saw a flicker of genuine hope in her eyes, replacing the hollow terror that had lived there for weeks. We didn't look like heirs to a heavily funded trust. We looked like two street kids who had slept in the woods. So, our first order of business was utilizing a tiny fraction of Arthur's war chest. I took 2 crisp $100 bills from the first stack, locked the rest of the cash and the original documents back in the safe, and tucked the manila envelope full of photographs and copies into my backpack. We hiked the 8 miles back to the county highway in the freezing dawn light, flagged down the early commuter bus, and rode it straight into downtown Seattle. We stopped at a department store right when it opened. I bought Chloe a warm wool coat, a clean sweater, and new boots. I bought myself a dark, conservative button-down shirt and a plain black jacket. We changed in the store bathrooms, washing the dried mud from our faces and hands. We needed to look like we belonged in the rooms we were about to walk into. By 10 a.m., we were standing in the lobby of the U.S. Bank Center in downtown Seattle. Bradley, Hughes, and Sterling occupied the entire 42nd floor. The elevator ride up made my stomach drop, but I gripped Chloe's hand tightly. When the polished steel doors parted, we stepped onto thick, cream-colored carpet. The walls were paneled in dark mahogany, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the Puget Sound. It smelled like expensive cologne and lemon polish. A receptionist, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a sharp, tailored suit, looked up from behind a massive marble desk. Her nameplate read Rebecca. She offered a practiced, tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "May I help you?" she asked, her tone subtly implying that we had pressed the wrong button on the elevator. "We're here to see William Sterling," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Mr. Sterling is a senior partner. He only sees clients by appointment," Rebecca replied, already turning her attention back to her dual monitors. "If you'd like to leave your names, I can have an associate reach out to you next week." "My name is Liam Pendleton," I said. "This is my sister, Chloe. We are the sole beneficiaries of the Arthur Pendleton Generation Skipping Trust. And if William Sterling doesn't see me in the next 3 minutes, my next stop is the FBI field office to hand them a file on corporate espionage and wire fraud involving this firm." Rebecca's fingers froze over her keyboard. She looked up, her corporate mask slipping for a fraction of a second. She took in the hard, unyielding look on my face, picked up her phone, and pressed a single button. She whispered hurriedly into the receiver, her eyes never leaving me. 2 minutes later, a tall, gray-haired man in a bespoke navy suit pushed through a set of heavy glass doors. He looked annoyed, but beneath the annoyance, I could see the sudden, sharp tension in his jaw. This was William Sterling. I recognized him from the emails in Grandpa Artie's file. "Mr. Pendleton," Sterling said, his voice a smooth, calculated baritone. "I am William Sterling. I must admit, I wasn't expecting you. Please, come back to my office." He led us down a long, silent hallway and ushered us into a massive corner office. He gestured to 2 leather chairs in front of his desk. Chloe and I sat down. Sterling walked behind his desk, steepling his fingers. "Now," Sterling began, offering a patronizing smile. "Rebecca mentioned something about the FBI and fraud. I understand you recently lost your mother, Liam. You have my deepest condolences. Grief makes us say irrational things. But making threats in a law office is highly unadvisable." I didn't blink. I unzipped my backpack, pulled out the manila envelope, and dropped the stack of photographs directly onto his pristine glass desk. The picture of him taking the envelope from Richard Caldwell in the dirt parking lot sat right on top. Sterling's patronizing smile vanished instantly. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure. "I have copies of this photo, and about 30 pages of emails between you and Richard Caldwell," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I know Richard is an acquisition specialist for Apex Freight. I know he targeted my mother to get my grandfather's land, and I know you helped him facilitate it." Sterling swallowed hard, his eyes locked on the photographs. "Liam, you don't understand the complexities of corporate land acquisition. I understand trust law, I interrupted, pulling out the copy of the irrevocable trust declaration. Arthur didn't just leave that land to my mother, he put it in a trust, for us. He strictly forbade the transfer of that land to a corporate entity or a non-blood relative, which means the deed Richard had my dying mother sign last month is legally void. Sterling closed his eyes for a brief second. When he opened them, the arrogant lawyer was gone, replaced by a man realizing his entire career was standing on a trapdoor. Richard told me the trust was dissolved, Sterling muttered, almost to himself. He told me he had power of attorney and that your mother broke the trust for medical expenses. I haven't seen the master file since Arthur died. He lied to you, I said coldly. And worse, Richard just sold our childhood home to a private buyer. He's closing on it this week. He thinks he owns it because of that forged deed. He's selling an asset that belongs to a federal trust. That's interstate wire fraud, forgery, and grand larceny. And since your name is all over the communications regarding my mother's estate, who do you think the federal prosecutor is going to look at when the FBI raids this office? Sterling sank into his leather chair, running a trembling hand over his face. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a greedy corporate lawyer who had trusted a shark, and now he was caught in the jaws. What do you want? Sterling asked, his voice barely a whisper. I want Richard, I said. I want him to lose everything, just like he made us lose everything. And I want my property secured. Today. Sterling spent the next hour frantically making phone calls, sweat beading on his forehead. He wasn't helping us out of the goodness of his heart. He was fighting for his freedom and his law license. By throwing Richard under the bus, Sterling was desperately trying to position himself as a victim of Richard's fraud rather than a co-conspirator. Richard is closing on your mother's house at 2 p.m. today, Sterling said, hanging up his desk phone. He looked slightly nauseous. He's at the title company office in Bellevue. The buyers are a young couple. They're handing over a cashier's check for $450,000. If he deposits that check, the money is going to be incredibly difficult to track down, I noted. He's not going to deposit it. A new voice boomed from the doorway. I turned around to see a broad-shouldered man in a rumpled tan suit holding a badge. Sterling had called in a favor from a contact at the Seattle Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Miller, the man introduced himself, walking into the room. He looked at the photographs on the desk, then at the trust documents. He let out a low whistle. Caldwell really stepped in it, attempting to sell a property locked in an irrevocable generation-skipping trust using a fraudulently obtained deed from a terminally ill woman. That's not just a white-collar crime. That's a fast track to federal prison. Can we stop the sale? Chloe asked, speaking up for the first time. Her voice was quiet but firm. We aren't just going to stop the sale, sweetheart, Detective Miller said, a grim, predatory smile spreading across his face. We're going to let him sit down at the table, sign his name on the fraudulent closing documents, and commit the felony on camera. Then we arrest him. At 1:30 p.m., the four of us, myself, Chloe, Sterling, and Detective Miller, were sitting in an unmarked police sedan in the parking lot of the Bellevue Title Company. Two uniformed officers were waiting in a cruiser around the back of the building. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them. Through the tinted windows, I watched Richard's sleek silver Audi pull into the lot. He stepped out, wearing a sharp grey suit, checking his gold watch with a look of supreme confidence. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery. He had thrown his dead wife's children into the street, stolen their inheritance, and was about to walk away $500,000 richer. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated hatred. Patience, Detective Miller murmured from the driver's seat, watching Richard walk through the glass doors. Let him get comfortable. Let him sign the papers. We waited for 20 agonizing minutes. At 1:55 p.m., Detective Miller's radio crackled. Suspect is in conference room B. Signatures are going down now. Showtime, Miller said. We got out of the car. I walked beside Detective Miller, my boots heavy on the pavement. We entered the lobby. The receptionist didn't even have time to ask us what we were doing before Miller flashed his badge and bypassed her desk, walking straight down the carpeted hallway. We reached the glass walls of conference room B. Inside, Richard was sitting at a large oak table across from a nervous-looking young couple and a title agent. Richard had a fancy fountain pen in his hand. He smiled, handed a thick stack of papers across the table, and reached for an envelope that clearly held the cashier's check. Detective Miller pushed the door open. It hit the wall with a loud bang. The room went dead silent. Richard's head snapped up, his smile vanishing instantly. His eyes darted from Detective Miller's badge to Sterling's pale, sweaty face, and finally they landed on me and Chloe. For a second, his brain simply couldn't process it. He had left us in the rain with nothing. We were supposed to be forgotten, broken, and helpless. "William?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking slightly as he looked at the lawyer. "What is the meaning of this? Who are these people?" "Put the pen down, Mr. Caldwell," Detective Miller said, stepping fully into the room. The two uniformed cops appeared behind him, blocking the doorway. "I am in the middle of a legal real estate closing," Richard shouted, his face flushing dark red. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "These kids are trespassing. I kicked them out of my house." "It was never your house, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a knife. I stepped forward, looking him dead in the eye. "And you didn't legally adopt us, which means you aren't family." Richard scoffed, trying to regain his corporate composure. "Your mother signed the deed over to me. I have the paperwork right here." "The deed is void," Sterling said, his voice trembling but loud enough for everyone to hear. "The property belongs to an irrevocable trust established by Arthur Pendleton. Sarah Pendleton was only the trustee. She had no legal right to transfer the deed to you, and you have no legal right to sell it." The title agent gasped, snatching the paperwork back from Richard's side of the table. The young couple looked horrified. Richard stared at Sterling, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "You told me the trust was dissolved. You said we were clear. You lied to me about your power of attorney," Sterling shot back, perfectly playing the role of the betrayed lawyer. "Richard Caldwell," Detective Miller interrupted, his voice booming over the argument. "You are under arrest for suspicion of wire fraud, forgery, grand larceny, and attempting to sell a fraudulently obtained asset. Stand up and put your hands behind your back." Richard didn't move. He looked down at the table, at the cashier's check he was inches away from touching. The reality of the situation finally crashed down on him. The meticulously planned long con, the years of faking love for my mother, the cruelty to us, the corporate greed, had all unraveled in less than 48 hours because he underestimated the wrong family. He slowly stood up, his shoulders sagging, looking older and smaller than I had ever seen him. The uniformed officer stepped forward, grabbed his arms, and slapped the heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. The click of the locking mechanism echoed loudly in the quiet conference room. As they marched him toward the door, he looked at me. There was no apology in his eyes, only a bitter, poisonous shock. "You're just a kid," he sneered, though his voice shook with fear. "You have nothing." "I have Grandpa Artie's bunker," I replied coldly. "And now, I have my house back. Have a nice life, Richard." The silence in the conference room after the police hauled Richard away was absolute. The young couple, who had been seconds away from handing over their life savings for a fraudulent deed, were visibly shaking. The title agent kept profusely apologizing, though none of it was her fault. Detective Miller stayed behind, just long enough to take our official statements, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder before he left. "You did good, kid," Miller had said, his voice entirely devoid of the usual cynical cop drawl. "You protected your sister. Let the system handle the rest." And the system, for once, worked with ruthless efficiency. William Sterling, desperate to avoid a federal indictment, sang like a canary. He handed over every single internal memo, email, and encrypted file regarding Apex Freight's land acquisition strategies. It turned out Richard Caldwell wasn't a rogue employee. He was part of a systemic corporate culture of predatory behavior. Apex had been using close contact strategies on vulnerable landowners across 3 different states. The ensuing FBI investigation forced Apex Pacific into a massive public scandal. Their stock plummeted, their CEO was subpoenaed, and the Rail Hub project was permanently scrapped. Sterling avoided prison by cooperating, but he was permanently disbarred and heavily fined, his career completely reduced to ashes. Richard, however, took the full, devastating brunt of the law. He had forged the signature of a terminally ill woman to steal a federally protected trust asset, and he had attempted to cross state lines with the profits. 6 months after his arrest, I sat in the back row of a federal courtroom, holding Chloe's hand, as the judge handed down his sentence. Richard wore a baggy orange jumpsuit, his hair graying rapidly, all his corporate slickness completely stripped away. When the judge read the sentence, 12 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole, Richard didn't even look back at us. He just stared at the floor, a broken, empty shell of a man who had finally met the consequences of his own greed. But the biggest revelation didn't come from the courtroom. It came a few weeks later, in the warm, mahogany-lined office of Thomas Bennett, the honest probate attorney the state had assigned to properly execute Grandpa Artie's trust. Chloe and I were sitting across from him, sipping hot tea. We had officially moved back into our childhood home. The sale had been voided, and thanks to the $50,000 in the bunker safe which Mr. Bennett legally integrated into the estate as a cash asset, we had enough money to cover the property taxes, utility bills, and my legal guardianship application for Chloe. Liam, Chloe, there is one final piece of your grandfather's estate we need to discuss, Mr. Bennett said, adjusting his glasses and pulling out a thick, sealed document that had been stored in a state vault. It concerns the 10-acre plot in the woods. Do you know why Apex Freight wanted that land so badly? To build a rail distribution hub, I said. It was in the middle of their route. Mr. Bennett shook his head slowly, a faint smile playing on his lips. That was the cover story. Your grandfather was a master structural engineer, Liam. Before he retired, he did a comprehensive geological survey of his own land. He discovered something Apex Freight desperately needed for a secondary, highly classified chemical processing plant they were planning to build near the rail line. Chloe leaned forward. What did he find? A massive, pristine, high-pressure subterranean aquifer, Mr. Bennett revealed, tapping the file. Millions of gallons of pure, naturally filtered water trapped beneath the bedrock. Apex needed that water for industrial cooling. Without your grandfather's land, their entire multi-million-dollar processing facility was dead in the water, pun intended. My mind raced back to the bunker. The heavy steel, the concrete epoxy floors, the deep earth ventilation. The bunker, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. He didn't just build a survival shelter, he built a cap. Exactly, Mr. Bennett nodded, looking incredibly impressed. Arthur built that reinforced subterranean structure directly over the primary access point to the aquifer. He physically locked away the one thing the corporation wanted, and then he put the land into an irrevocable trust to make sure they could never legally buy it. He wasn't paranoid, Liam. He was a brilliant tactician protecting his family's future. So, what is the land worth? Chloe asked, her voice hushed. Mr. Bennett opened the file. Apex Freight is out of the picture, but the county water district has been looking for a new municipal water source for a decade. I took the liberty of contacting them on behalf of the trust. They are offering to lease the water rights from you. You keep the land, you keep the bunker, but they pump the water. The preliminary contract they've drafted will pay the trust approximately $400,000 a year in perpetuity. I just sat there, the air completely knocked out of my lungs. We weren't just safe, we were secure for the rest of our lives. The following weekend, Chloe and I borrowed a friend's truck and drove the long, winding dirt road back out to Grandpa Artie's property. The weather had warmed up, the spring sun melting the last of the winter frost and turning the forest into a vibrant, living green. We hiked up to the ruined cabin and opened the heavy iron hatch hidden in the tall grass. We walked down the metal stairs, but this time there was no fear. We flipped the breakers, and the warm LED lights flooded the concrete walls. I walked into the back bedroom and sat down at the small wooden desk. I pulled open the bottom drawer. It was empty now, the lockbox gone, but I ran my hand over the worn wood. Arthur knew exactly what he was doing. He knew the vultures would circle when he was gone. He knew his daughter was too trusting, and he knew his grandchildren would eventually need a shield. So, he spent his final years building us an impenetrable fortress, not just out of concrete and steel, but out of ironclad trust law and subterranean water rights. Chloe came into the room, holding one of the heavy wool blankets. She folded it neatly and placed it back on the bunk bed. "We should fix up the cabin above," she said softly, looking around the room. "Make it a real house, so we can visit him properly." "Yeah," I agreed, a lump forming in my throat. "I think he'd like that." Looking back, the night Richard locked us out in the freezing rain felt like the end of our lives. In reality, it was the exact moment our true lives began. Grief and betrayal had pushed us to the absolute edge of survival, but the very mud we were forced to crawl through hid the key to our salvation. We learned the hard way that blood doesn't always make someone family, and the people who claim to care for you can sometimes be the monsters waiting in the dark. But we also learned that true love, the kind of love Grandpa Artie had for us, transcends time, death, and circumstance. He couldn't be there to protect us from Richard himself, but he left behind the weapons, the shelter, and the truth we needed to fight back and win. Today, Chloe is thriving in college, and I manage the estate, but we still go out to the bunker every autumn, just to sit in the quiet, grateful for the eccentric engineer who saved us from beyond the grave.